Welcome to the Linguistic Validation Café series, a place to gather, connect, learn, and grow together by creating community, embracing our cultures, and sharing our passion for linguistic validation. This is the space and time we take to embrace diversity and discuss how to improve the human aspects of medical translation. In this fourth episode, called Cognitive Interviews, Methodologies, and Cross-Cultural Adaptation in COA Development and Linguistic Validation, we're going to learn about science-backed methodologies for conducting cognitive debriefing in linguistic validation with our special guest, Dr. Keith Meadows, renowned researcher and COA developer, and our moderator, Tomislav Geršić, Managing Director of Borliner. I am your host, Noor Ferrante, and this is the Linguistic Validation Café. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And with our super special guest, I'm so happy, Keith, that you are here. Thank you so much for joining us. And with Tomislav, who will be moderating today. Thank you. I'm going to start by introducing Keith and so that you know, he's an independent researcher living in Oxfordshire, providing consultancy and training in health-related research. He has a BA honors and a PhD in psychology and is a chartered psychologist at the British Psychological Society. Keith is the owner of Health Outcomes Insights and an independent research consultancy with a focus on patient centricity, serving academia, life science researchers, healthcare agencies, medical and pharmaceutical industry across a range of conditions and diseases. He has wide experience in health services research, with particular emphasis on assessing the psychosocial impact of living with diabetes, health-related quality of life, health survey research, patient-reported outcome measures, patient experience, and engagement. He has held academic posts at the Universities of London, Newcastle, and Hull, undertaking research across much of Europe, including Russia, Spain, Scandinavia, and the Low Countries. Keith has over 100 research communications and publications, and is a reviewer for 7 scientific journals. He has also lectured at undergraduate and postgraduate level at the universities of Brighton, City, Hull, and London. So super welcome. It is really a gift to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, and very briefly to introduce you, Tomislav Geršić, which most of you already know. He's a clinical research professional with 15 years of medical translation experience, more than a decade of which within linguistic validation. He's the founder and managing director of Borliner, provider of clinical outcome assessments, translation and linguistic validation, licensing and COA migration, and consulting services for copyright holders, pharmaceutical companies, and CROs, as well as LSPs. Welcome, Tomislav. So since Tomislav is our moderator today, I'm going to just give it over to you.
Thank you, Noor. Thank you for a kind invitation in your introduction. It's a pleasure seeing again so many familiar faces, and a special welcome to you, Dr. Meadows. It's a pleasure to have you here in our small community discussing topics of interest for us as linguists working in linguistic validation. Although not scientists, we draw on sound methodological guidance and background from research and published papers to be able to do proper cross-cultural adaptation of COA instruments for clinical research, scientific research globally. So thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.
I think we're all looking forward to the opportunity of learning from your experience and asking questions. What I wanted to start with was perhaps if you could give us some introduction on what we just discussed previously about brief history of cognitive interviews in COA development and their role in COA development.
Yeah, sure. As I'm mentioning before, it really goes back to 1983 when social scientists and cognitive scientists got together with the idea of working together so that we could improve the design of survey questionnaires. And part of that was to begin to understand what the cognitive processes are in responding to survey questions. And that became known as the cognitive aspects of survey methodology, or CASM as short. And that, as I said, that was back in 1983. And following on from that, there have been numerous publications and research carried out by the key members of CASM over the years. And it wasn't particularly specific to health-related work. It was general questionnaire and survey design. And it's only become recent in the last 5 or 6 years that cognitive interviewing itself has become part of COA development. But I'm not quite sure how it came about, because as we were talking earlier on, so much research has gone on in the 80s and the 90s about cognitive interviewing and understanding the cognitive processes through which respondents go through when answering a question. Whenever you're reading or discussing cognitive debriefing in COA development, there's never any acknowledgement or reference to the work that was carried out by CASM over the last 20 odd years. And the work that CASM carried out is extremely important. For one thing, it's identified a framework through which respondents actually go through a number of stages in answering the survey questionnaire. And this has never been done before. And those stages are basically comprehension of the question, the recall activity in terms of recalling from memory the information to answer that question, judgment, is the information that my memory has pulled out, the facts, is this sufficient to answer the question? And then finally, the cognitive process of mapping your answer, your mental answer, to the options that have been provided. And so that has provided the basis of the framework for developing different types of probing during the cognitive interview. And so that's one very important thing, but also an equally important work that came out of CASM. And again, something that is never discussed in papers describing cross-cultural, either cross-cultural adaptation or cognitive debriefing as part of COA development, is that you have two types of cognitive interviewing, which is, the first is what they refer to as reparative, and that is really about using your cognitive interview to identify weaknesses in your question itself. Is the respondent having difficulty understanding, comprehending the terms in the question? Are they having problems recalling that kind of information? And that's basically refers to as reparative. The second type of cognitive interview is not about what's wrong with the question. The second type of interviewing is, what kind of heuristics are people using to answer this type of question? And this is a very important distinction when we're talking about undertaking cognitive debriefing or cognitive interviewing. is to make it very clear that when we're doing cognitive interviewing, what is the objective? Are we looking to see whether the questions themselves are functioning okay? Do they need rewording? Do they need modification, etc.? Or are we interested in more broadly, how do respondents answer this type of question?
And so the technique
Now,
also differs depending on the objective. Is that correct?
yes, absolutely. So most of us, I would guess, who are doing cognitive debriefing are doing it to do repetitive work, to look at the questions itself. Is there ambiguity in the wording? I can give you an example, a very simple example. Say you have a question like, how would you rate your health, your general health, over the past week? And then you provide the options. Now, a repetitive approach, you would put that to the interviewer, to the respondent, and watch them answer that question. And then you might probe to say, what was the past week? What did the past week mean to you? And you might get 7 days, you might get Monday to Friday, you might get all sorts of things. So clearly what that's showing through this repetitive approach is that there's a mishmash of people understanding what the past week was. And so therefore, what we'd say is, right, that's a problem. We need to rectify that. So for example, we would then rephrase the question as, over the past 7 days, how would you rate your overall health? So that's the repetitive approach. And that, I think, is what most of us here today, if we are doing cognitive debriefing, is that kind of work. We're not really interested in how do respondents, what kind of heuristics do patients or respondents use in answering this question. That's more of the sort of hypothetical, theoretical side. But it's important that this distinction is made when you're reading about or undertaking a project using debriefing. What are you doing it for? Are you doing it to repair, to see what weaknesses are in the question itself, and you need to modify that as a result? Or are we interested in the heuristics, the cognitive heuristics that go on in our head when we're answering a question? And as I say, I think people here up today for this podcast, the majority will be only interested in the cognitive debriefing in terms of repairing and identifying what that question is.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
that can also go for the cross-cultural side of things, where we can be asking the understanding of a given concept across different languages. So again, we would be using the repetitive approach, and what we could do there is, within the linguistic validation, looking at the concepts within linguistic validation, such as semantics, what does the concept mean, etc., content. We could use those stages of linguistic validation as the basis for us to undertake the cognitive interview and develop the probes, so that we are getting that to that cultural equivalence.
Is the methodology in research in the existing research papers, is the cognitive interviewing methodology established? Is this something that's sound and we can draw on, or is there some ambiguity? And my question is, how to properly do cognitive debriefing, the repetitive approach?
There is no specific framework, and this is the point we've been speaking about, in that when you look at papers, people just say, oh, or they report, we've undertaken cognitive interviews. I looked at a couple of examples this morning, for example, where in papers where they refer to as, we undertook cognitive interviewing. which means that, they were asking people whether they understood what the meaning of the question was. What I'm trying to put forward here is to build more on the work of Kassem and use those stages that Tarangu came up with, those 4 stages that I mentioned, about comprehension, recall, judgment, and the final stage of mapping. But again, when you actually read a lot of the a lot of this stuff around CDs, that's never discussed, and I don't know why. Going back to the work of Kassem in 1983, as I say, it formed the real basis of conducting work. So what I would say is that we need to go back to that work in 1983 and subsequent from that, because they are still producing important papers, and start to use that as our framework or benchmark in how we should be undertaking and reporting of cognitive interviews in COA development and cross-cultural adaptation. And as I mentioned to you earlier on, looking at the FDA document, I think it was 2022 or 2020, it just simply states that they recommend undertaking cognitive interviewing, and that's all they say. There's no sort of more detailed description as to what it should be. And I wrote a paper around the application of cognitive interviewing last year, I think it was, for the journal Clinical Nursing Research. I can't give you the reference now, but that does summarize in some detail some of the work of Kassem and the principles of what is the theoretical framework behind doing cognitive debriefing, and issues around how to conduct the interview itself, because even conducting the interview itself brings up different issues. What type of probes are you going to use? Are you going to use think aloud, or are you going to do concurrent verbal probing? Again, these are all things that need to be discussed as part of the objectives and setting out how that piece of work is going to be done. And I think, again, it's going back to the work of Kassem and more subsequent work. I don't mean work from people who are just developing COAs and doing debriefing, because that's telling us nothing, but going back and looking at the real work that has been carried out by the cognitive scientists and the survey researchers. I held held an international workshop when I was at the University of Hull, and it was very specific to development of COAs. And the summary of that workshop was published by Quality of Life Research. I think it was 2000 or 2001. I can probably dig that reference out, and if anyone's interested, you can read that up. It's 2 summaries about the workshop, and what I did, I brought over some of the key people that were involved at Kassem at that time, and they presented their work around how it would be applicable to COA development. So I can dig that reference out, and I can also dig the reference out for the paper that I mentioned in.
It will be very useful. We can add it in the video description.
Yes, it's the cognitive interview methodologies, right? The one you have from the clinical nursing research. Okay.
Yep.
Yes,
Brilliant.
yes.
Yeah. And also I'll dig out the reference for the for the quality of life one on summarizing the workshop
Yes.
back in 2000.
Lovely. Yes. I wanted to ask you, because you have mentioned the types of probes we have, retrospectively versus think aloud, and maybe well, some of the colleagues that are here listening, well, they do, all of them, the cognitive debriefing, but maybe these terms, you know, are not as familiar. So and what you mentioned, like retrospectively, as you explained to us the other day that we were having a conversation, it's the part in the cognitive debriefing interview when you ask the patient if they have understood while they were filling in the questionnaire, if they had any issues filling it in, and so on and so forth. So it's retrospectively, no, they have already done it and they tell you how it went. And then the think aloud part is the part we call paraphrasing, right? When we ask each of the items to be paraphrased and so on. And what you mentioned earlier is that there is some cognitive debriefing being conducted where, in truth, they are only doing the retrospective probing, no? To say it in a nutshell. And including when we do focus groups and so on, and that's a topic that we would like to tap into. But what are the risks, or why, you know, conducting a retrospective cognitive debriefing using only those probes is really not the best choice, or what's your view on that? I would love to know.
The retrospective, each method has its benefits and disadvantages. The retrospective, of course, is that you're asking the respondent, after completing the questionnaire, what their thought processes were, and therefore that can have an impact on, really, you know, they've already gone 5 or 6 questions or 10 questions or 10 questions further on, and so there's that issue of, are they actually recalling accurately at that moment? You're going back, say, 10 minutes ago, and you can't remember specifically, whereas if you're doing think aloud, that is telling the interviewer, sorry, what the respondent is thinking as they answer the question. The problem with that is that the think aloud as a process can be quite difficult for some people to carry out. Similarly, it's a process that is actually disturbing the thought processes. My preference is to do the concurrent verbal probing. So as the person is completing the questionnaire, the researcher actually asks, well, or puts in, applies the probes, and those probes can be either standardized or spontaneous. Now, when I talk about standardized, what I mean here is that prior to the cognitive interviews themselves, the cognitive interviewer and the questionnaire designer work together to identify where there may be potential problems in the questionnaire itself, and therefore the probes can be produced prior to the interview, and they can then be asked at the appropriate times while the respondent is answering the questionnaire. Then also there's what is spontaneous probing or emerging probing, in which, for example, the interviewer might notice that the respondent is being somewhat hesitant in answering a question, and therefore the interviewer would say something along the lines, you appear to be a little bit hesitant there in answering that question. Can you tell me why? So this is something that hasn't been pre-planned. It emerges as the interview goes on. So, we need to be thinking about, are we going to do retrospective? Are we going to do concurrent? Are we going to do think aloud? Are we going to do verbal probing? And again, sorry to come back to it again, this is something that is very rarely ever discussed in the methodology, certainly around COA development. So I think each approach does have its strengths. The general consensus from my understanding is that the retrospective is a little bit lower down in terms of a methodology compared to concurrent and verbal probing.
We have a question from Eva Nyblom, and she says, many times we are asked to ask the participant to paraphrase the questions, which sometimes may be very basic questions. She says, how to paraphrase, how do you feel? Right? Like, it's true. And it's sometimes, well, we tend, at least in linguistic validation, we tend to be very, very thorough. And we ask the patient to paraphrase every single thing, even pain, right? And for example, a word like pain is very difficult to paraphrase, or like Eva mentioned, how do you feel, right? It's difficult. So where do you draw the line? Where do you relax a bit and allow the person to repeat the same term, because you know that they understand that term, but within the context? So
I think again, this is where the skill of the interviewer comes in, knowing when to probe, how to probe, what to probe, and working face to face with the respondent. Questions like how do you feel is for the patient not particularly easy to answer. I mean, it's, as you say, it's like describing pain. The way pain is described is very different from each other, and there are cultural influences as well. And so therefore I think it's the skill of the interviewee, of the interviewer.
Yeah, you have said something very, very important for us cross-culturally, because now you have really given me the answer, I guess, because it depends on the culture. For example, maybe pain is not as, it's more clear, but when we say discomfort, there may be cultures that consider discomfort closer to pain than to simply some bothersome symptom. And so we really need to paraphrase that and ensure that it has been translated and understood as the source concept that we are measuring.
Well, as we discussed, when we had a chat last week, that it's a sort of a tripartite arrangement where you work with the questionnaire designer and the linguist, and perhaps if the linguist may not be the person that's doing the cognitive interviewing, but all three working together to develop those probes, because the interviewer, it's her or himself, may not be aware of these linguistic differences, and therefore something like this, you need input from the linguist. Certainly, when you're doing cross-cultural adaptation, what does this term mean? And that's where, for example, doing focus groups on this can be quite complex, because groups, cultures differ, and you'll get a different set of meanings from one focus group, from one culture, from another different culture focus group. So again, it's working as a team As I think I mentioned to you that we did something like this in Russia, where we were going to do the cognitive interviewing, but we needed input from the Russian linguists as to where potential problems were going to be. They were giving us guidance, and also at that particular time, I was also the designer of the questionnaire that was being used. So, as the designer and the interviewer, with help from the linguists.
Yeah. Yeah, we see that, for example, the importance of translatability assessment, right, during the process of COA development. And really, well, we wanted to ask you also about the importance of our role as linguists within the development phase of the questionnaires. Because what happens to us is when we are linguistically validating a questionnaire, and it has not gone through, let's say, a prior translatability assessment, or a linguist hasn't been involved, or it's a very outdated questionnaire where a patient centricity has not been taken into account, and so on. Or maybe even the methodology used for cognitive debriefing during the development is not as, let's say, thorough. We have many issues regarding cultural sensitivity, taboos, things that are really offensive for people, or things that directly are not meaningful to patients. And well, we do our cognitive debriefing interviews, we do all the process, we inform the developers. But since the questionnaire has gone through all the stages, it has been already, let's say, licensed, it's very difficult to make changes in the source at this stage, right? Yep. So I would like to ask you how, or in what ways linguists could be more involved, and how this awareness can be raised to developers, so that we can participate more there, and also how we could tackle these cultural issues, because in the end we have to just let the questionnaire go into the stream with all those issues that are going to be highly offensive, and we know it, and we can't do anything about it. So how can we re-edit, the source and so on? So I would like your views on that.
I think the EORCT, EORCT, which is a cancer type questionnaire. It's very sound measure, and I think it's been going now. It's got to be at least 20 years old, that questionnaire, but it went through absolutely incredible validation processes itself. And I think the way that was developed, there are two ways in which we can look at cultural adaptation. And that is, you already have the existing questionnaire, but comes with that the problems that you've just been mentioning, that you're unable to modify it. But you have the existing questionnaire, and then you put it through rounds of evaluation through cognitive interviewing across different languages, and then developing for each language a version of the original questionnaire, but modified in accordance with the language that it's going to be used in. So it'll be not a literal translation, but it will be a translation of the original questionnaire. That's one approach. And I think that the EORTC, if my memory serves me properly, what they did, they developed the questionnaire for each of the languages that they were doing the study in. So you had a different questionnaire, but covering the same content as the original, but it was being developed individually. So you weren't stuck with one questionnaire and just modifying it for each language. You were developing the questionnaire specific for that particular culture and language. And so, but that gets round the problem you're talking about, that you can't modify the questionnaire. The problem does exist, as you say, if you're using an existing questionnaire, and it cannot, there's already built-in weaknesses in that questionnaire, and you can't do anything about it. All you've got to do is cross-culturally adapt the weaknesses, and that's it. So these two approaches, using the standard existing questionnaire or developing the questionnaire specific for the language groups that the study is going to be in, which of course is a lot more costly.
Does using translatability assessments during the early phases of COA development alleviate this, in your experience?
Say that again, Thomas, sorry.
So using a translatability assessment in an early stage of COA development, does this enable you to alleviate these issues with, it does.
Yeah, it can do, yes. And this is where it's like, it's an inherent problem around questionnaire design, that everybody thinks that they can design a questionnaire. And that's not true. Designing and developing a questionnaire is a very, very skilled task. You know, even how you place different questions in which order, and how you affect memory and recall and so on and so forth. And so what you're getting is, you're getting a lot of people who've been developing these COAs without actually understanding the real principles of questionnaire design. And so by doing so, you're finishing up with a questionnaire that is less than good. And I can give you one example of this. There's a diabetes questionnaire looking at distress, and one of the questions is it's asking two things, which we interpret, which we call double-barreled. A question is asking you two things, and how can you answer two things when your answer to those two things may differ? And so, for example, does your diabetes cause you to have high distress and not eating? Well, you know, that's a double-barrel question, and that's a very common feature that you find in questionnaires that are designed by people who are not really questionnaire designers. And there are plenty of examples, certainly in the field of diabetes, of survey questionnaires that are double-barreled, confusing, ambiguous, and as you say, you're stuck with that. You know, it's existing and you can't do anything about it. And so what you're doing is you're cross-culturally adapting a measure that's already got fundamental weaknesses in it.
Yeah,
I'd like to return a little bit, excuse me, Noor, to the topic of using focus groups as a cognitive debriefing method. In my view, how I see it, you lose the cognitive part in in such an approach, because you have 5 or 10 people fighting who gets the chance to speak. Then you have everyone else listening to their answer. That's highly which suggests
it's influencing other people. You may have not thought of something, and then somebody says it, and you think, "Oh yeah, well I had that when I was answering the question."
Yeah, and you're not going to be answering the questionnaire with everybody else together, right?
Yeah.
The other 4 are not with you when you are answering the questionnaire. So
So again, I think this comes about because this has come through. I think there at the moment I've found about 5 or 6 papers that have been using focus groups as cognitive interviewing, but I think it comes about the going back to what I was saying at the beginning of this podcast, that a lot of people don't understand or know about the origins of cognitive interviewing. And therefore they think, oh, yeah, well, we can do that by using a focus group. No, you can't. Focus groups are not giving you insights into the individual cognitive processes as they answer the question. And how they can call it a cognitive interview topic guide, I don't know. It makes me pull my hair out because it's not a CI interview guide. But this is the paper that I'm drafting out, which I'm going to send to you both to to comment on.
You mentioned also several different methods, approaches to conducting actual cognitive interviews. In the context of, and that was all in the context, of course, of COA development. And I would like to hear from you in the context of linguistic validation of cross-cultural adaptation. Which approach do you think is the best to be used to get the best results?
In undertaking cognitive interviews?
Yes, within linguistic validation.
I would, my personal view, if I was setting up a project, I would obviously go for the repetitive approach, and I would go for concurrent, but with verbal probing using standardized probes, and also working with any emerging probes that need to be addressed. So that would be my view, that think aloud is difficult for some respondents. You have to provide
and concurrent is think aloud, right?
Concurrent is concurrent. No, not necessarily. Think aloud is concurrent because you're thinking aloud as you answer the question. But then you've also got concurrent where you're not thinking aloud, but the interviewer is doing the probing. So you're doing the verbal probing. So my view is thinking aloud, getting the interviewee to think aloud is quite demanding. And as I say, they should, prior to the interview itself, the interviewee should have some training as to how to do it. So my approach would be, it depends, of course, on the circumstances and the objectives also, but my approach would be to get the interviewee to read the question, and then if you've got any standardized probes that you want to ask, then do so. But if the interviewee is reading and answering the question and you haven't got any standardized probes that you want to input, then that would be my approach. And then if there's any emerging probes, then like for example, hesitation, or sort of leans back and goes, then, why are you doing that kind of thing? So that would be my approach. The retrospective recall probably is the least effective. These issues are raised in the workshop that I'll be running next week. Some of that.
Oh yes, for everyone, that we were going to mention it at the end, but we can take this chance. Keith Meadows will have a workshop on February 12th, and it will be a 3-hour workshop. So if you want to join, just we will leave you the link in the description so that you can register, because it's going to be a great chance to learn from him. Thank you, Keith, for putting up this workshop.
Thank you.
On the lines of what you were saying, in my experience conducting cognitive debriefing, I've seen that if I don't do paraphrase, well, I always do paraphrasing, right? But it's when I do the paraphrasing, when we get there, even though they haven't hesitated or anything, sometimes they paraphrase something absolutely different than the intended meaning. And they do it sure of themselves. And they say, yes, I absolutely understood. The other day, it was a question regarding what is your level of pain at rest? And the translation was very similar in Spanish. But it meant like when you are not doing exercise, and there was in brackets, there was, laying down or sitting, no, when you're doing nothing. It was for patients with gout, right? And one of the respondents indicated, oh yes, at rest, when the doctor has prescribed me 7 days of rest, and I have to say how much pain I had in those 7 days. But no, it's when you are resting, not doing any physical movement or anything, right? So she had interpreted that, and she was absolutely sure that, and she didn't have any problems filling in or anything, the response. So I was wondering, it's true that it's painstaking to paraphrase. You have to train the respondents a little bit before the interview so that they understand what they will need to do and practice a bit with some examples. And it's true, sometimes they just keep answering the question instead of paraphrasing.
That's a good point.
But I was thinking, would it be possible, like, in order to speed things up, or let's say, could we focus on the specific concepts that we are measuring in that item? Like, at least make them paraphrase the specific concept. It's like, okay, if you're going to get rid of paraphrasing, but at least paraphrase that, because otherwise, really, we get very erroneous results in our translations.
No, I think that's a good idea, that some form of discussion with the patient on issues like that, because that can be quite big. Patients or respondents to questionnaire, we know they tend to go through the questions blah 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 blah, without really thinking. What we want them to be doing is to be thinking about the question. And so something like that, in terms of now this is what we want you to do when reading or answering the question. We want you to spend time answering the question and thinking about the question, because otherwise they can answer a 10-item questionnaire in about 5 seconds. Well, you can't tell me that they've given the question any particular thought. They've just answered. So I agree with you that needs to be brought forward.
And when we do it retrospectively, like when we ask them at first if they have understood the questionnaire, anything has offended them or whatever, and they say, no, everything is clear, nothing has offended me. But then we go through all the paraphrasing item by item, and many issues arise. But we don't ask them again. I do ask them again at the end. So now, we get what's the result? Like, do we ask at first? Do we ask afterwards? When we do our reporting, we normally introduce the general impression of this retrospective exercise, and then all the paraphrasing. But it's not the same if we ask it before than we ask it afterwards. So
what you're suggesting there is a kind of blend between, say, concurrent and retrospective, and there's no rationale as to why you can't do that. That you as they're answering the question, you're probing where you think it's necessary, or where you've got your standardized probes. But then again, at the end of that, you can also do a retrospective, and
you can do a second round of retrospective, right? And maybe indicate that, like, first round of second retrospective, all the paraphrasing, and then the second round, what issues arose and how they consider the questionnaire. Because sometimes I've seen patients that, for example, there was a question, pain as bad as if you were dead. And at first, when they read that, they just, it's okay. But when they paraphrase, they said, this offends me immensely and hurts me. And if I'm really scared with the illness or something, to me, it's just very disturbing. And so, it's
absolutely.
interesting.
It's like, that's a very good point that you brought up. It's, if you feel it's necessary, then I think it's, doing a retrospective recall. Because a lot of people will answer questions without really thinking about it. I do. When sometimes, when I've got an online questionnaire, I go,
yes, that's true. We have several questions here. Is that okay, Tomislav, if we try to tackle some of these? Jason, thank you so much. He's asking in relation to AI technology, artificial intelligence, and if there are any pain points during processes that you feel can be resolved by AI technology.
I don't, to answer your question, Jason, at the moment, I don't know enough about AI. I did AI as part of my psychology degree many years ago. But AI, from what I understood it to be then, is very different from now. So I really can't answer your question because I don't know enough about AI at the moment. Sorry.
I was thinking, like, because would it be possible to use AI for checking if what is contained in the audio recordings has been correctly transcribed, let's say?
Something like that can be done.
Because that's
definitely
an idea.
Yes.
Or maybe for transcription directly of the verbatim answers or paraphrasing of the patient.
Something
considering
like that.
The AI tool is highly can retain confidentiality, and it's a PRO. It's a pro version, not
perhaps for coding also.
What did you say, Tomislav?
We could perhaps also use AI for coding purposes, so for analyzing qualitative data and coding the answers.
That would be great.
Coding again is another issue that's not discussed in terms of reporting. I mean, there are different types of coding and different types of analysis that can be done, and different types of coding within that. So again, this is something that's not discussed, and I will be discussing that in the workshop next week.
Okay. Do you want to read
carry on.
Go with the next one? Mariana Teixeira is asking, I think it's also very important to be careful with how to probe in a way that is not leading, suggesting an answer. That's very important thing.
Hence probing, not prompting.
The difference between probing and prompting. Yes. That's right. It's difficult. I have to recognize, for me, sometimes it's difficult that the line, because I can feel sometimes that I'm prompting and I'm like, oh my God, maybe.
Again, it comes with skill. It really comes with skill that you have to restrict yourself in terms of thinking about how you're going to do it. But the thing is, don't prompt, probe. Always put it as a question, not as a suggestion.
An open question.
An open question. We will ask you about tips for cognitive interviewing, but we'll ask you later because we have more questions here. Emmanuel Genot is asking, I was going to say focus group are not for the same purpose and require a different set of expertise from the moderator.
Absolutely. Totally agree. You cannot do cognitive interviewing via focus groups. The whole rationale, the theoretical underpinning of the two is very different and requires different skills.
And are focus groups used, for example, for concept elicitation during COA development?
Oh yeah, you can use them as, yeah, focus groups can be used in early stages of development of the measure. I did this when I was developing the diabetes health profile, that I did focus groups with the clinicians, and also then one-to-one interviews with diabetic patients. So you can do it as a multi-method approach. But focus groups give you insights into a different form of reality than in-depth or cognitive interviews. The reality in a focus group is the fact that you're with other people and you're being influenced. Whereas the cognitive interview, you are in the reality of the individual, him or herself, and so you're going to get different information.
Yeah, I think focus groups, like in my case, which I'm an MS patient, and there's an initiative is called PROMS initiative, which is internationally trying to come up with a PRO measure that really is meaningful for patients like us with MS. And I can understand focus groups that can be great for when we are expressing what's meaningful to us, and then we get to the point of saturation altogether, because sometimes until you talk with other patients like you, and all of you put together the symptoms, and you realize, oh yes, my God, I had that symptom too. And whereas if they ask you alone, you may not come up with all of that. And together, I understand that you can really express maybe more comprehensively all the landscape of your condition, and how you are, and how your quality of life is. And so I can understand the great use there, but not without cognitive debriefing. Like, I would suggest doing always both things. No, if you're going to be doing focus groups, never leave out cognitive debriefing But I understand that cognitive debriefing is not for creating, let's say, the concepts that then will be selected and drafted into the scale for them doing cognitive debriefing. Is the previous phase, right? Where we are getting the patients to say what's meaningful to them, and choose
absolutely
our concepts. Yes, but I see that it doesn't make much sense, because it's different. It's just not cognitive debriefing.
No,
as simple as that. Focus groups are not cognitive debriefing. That's all. And
well, it's so frustrating.
No, that's what it's like in a nutshell. I'm like, okay. What other question we have? Natalie Netkova is saying, how can quality assurance process in cognitive debriefing be improved?
Say that again, sorry.
Yes, how can we improve, ensure quality in the process of cognitive debriefing?
Basically, a lot of what we've been saying in this podcast is the way to improve the quality, and clearly defining your objectives. What's the purpose of the cognitive interviews? What kind of methods are you going to use? What type of program are you going to use? Working with the questionnaire designer, if possible, prior to the interview, and if necessary, in cross-cultural adaptation with linguists. All of that will go to improve the quality of the information that you get through the cognitive debriefing.
And in relation to quality, what we call in linguistics quality assurance, at least in our, in the sense of, once we have the report already drafted, how do we ensure that the interviewer, is doing it with quality enough? And because we have different methodologies, we work with different companies or different clients, and methodologies vary. And sometimes we have to do the entire
Yeah.
Let's say paraphrasing, of course, we do the retrospective part, we do the think aloud part. And when we input it in the report, in some companies, we have to translate verbatim into English, back into English, right? Like back translate. And then let's say the developer or the sponsor will have that. And we do our rounds of analysis and rounds of discussions and so on until we get it finalized. But for example, you as developer, if you ask us, let's say you have your diabetes questionnaire and you want to do linguistic validation into several languages, and you want to do cognitive debriefing, and you ask us for a specific methodology, and we will send you whatever you want, right? But then in the case of this company I'm talking about, you will receive the report, everything in English. So the verbatim sentences of each respondent, it will be in English, although they said it in their target language at first. Others, what they do is you input them, but in the target language directly, but they are analyzed by another linguist who will check if everything is okay and so on. But you as developer will have no information, just a confirmation that it is okay. But you cannot really check if each of the responses, right? And the audios that you have are in the target language, not in English, right? And then we have other approaches where we don't even input anything. It's the audio, and we just confirm as the interviewers or specialist linguists that everything is okay and the respondents correctly paraphrased and understood.
Yeah.
And of course, we have other companies that do focus groups, and we are clear on that right now on what we think about that. So
companies, I mean, again, I think it's because a lack of understanding of what it's all about, and time is pressure on them, and they want to minimize time and costs, don't they? And so it's it's not an understanding of the pure meaning of what cognitive engineering is all about.
Yeah. So what would you suggest? Like, you as a developer, what would you like to receive? Let's say you tell, hey, Tomislav, I wanted to validate this. What methodology would you prefer? Like, how would you like to receive your report? What would you like from us, from all the different languages?
Obviously, as a developer and being English, I can only speak English, and therefore the report would have to be in English for me to understand. But again, this is something that I cover in the workshop next week. That there has to be an agreement on the various components of a research report. How would the respondents recruited? What training did the interviewer have? All sorts of things, like where were the interviews conducted? What kind of analysis was used to? Was it taped and was it transcribed? And if so, how was that data analyzed? Was it thematically analyzed? Was it coded and then analyzed? And if it was coded, what type of coding was it? And then a very clear discussion of what the key problems were identified with each of the questions. And you're paying, you're paying these people to do this work, and therefore, if I'm paying a company to do some cognitive interviews around my measure, then I want the fullest and maximum amount of data as to what they as to how they conducted the interview, and what problems plus recommendations that they could put forward.
Okay. Yeah, Tomislav.
I was trying to unmute. So we all work per the eSport guidelines published in 2005, and per the guidelines, the developer, if they're involved, which is always a good thing if developer is involved, the developer's review is after the back translations, but prior to the cognitive debriefing stage. Do you think it would be actually beneficial to change the order of these steps based on what you just said, that perhaps to have the developer review the cognitive debriefing, but then there is also the benefit if they do the review of the back translations prior to cognitive debriefing to be able to ensure that the concepts have been retained.
You've got to get the concepts right before you can culturally adapt them. The basic thing is, are the concepts in that questionnaire understood? If they're not, then you're wasting your time. So it's the thing to first of all is to make sure that those concepts are understood and where necessary to be modified. It's collaboration. It's collaboration all the way through.
You think double developers review would be good to have in place?
Absolutely.
Before and after the cognitive debriefing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what I find sometimes is that the respondents provide many ideas also in relation to the questionnaire design, because sometimes visually they don't see it well, or they even consider that some of the response choices are too many, and they don't get to answer well, and many things that may be very valuable for the developer after the cognitive debriefing. And even though he may not change anything, but at least it has come to his attention, and in a future round of revisions for the questionnaire or versions may be implemented. And that's very valuable, because if we put together all that energy, it helps improve the questionnaire. So that's
absolutely.
I think what your idea, Tomislav, it's I think it's great, and
I agree. Clarification right from the beginning, and this is why all of this has to be really thought out. And we conducted cognitive interviews on 14 people is telling us nothing. It's meaningless. I might as well say, well, I went and spoke to my dog, and if he barked 3 times, he understood what I was saying. It's going into it much deeper and thinking more about it, rather than just a catch-all phrase of we did a series of cognitive interviews.
We have another question from Cathal Monahan. How best to effectively handle cognitive debriefing interview situations where there are a large number of repetitive questions, where data changes minimally between questions? And he continues, I have a current project with 14 questionnaires. Each questionnaire contains a single question. So 14 times I have the respondent 3 general impression questions before they start paraphrasing each questionnaire. Some of the questionnaires are identical except for a different time period. For example, how would you rate the severity of your joint pain? Hours? Yeah. How would you rate the severity of your joint pain in the past 7 days?
Yeah, I had a questionnaire similar to that. That they had the same questions, but under different categories. So you were basically asking, so for example, say if you had 3 categories in the questionnaire, but each category had the same 10 questions. And so strictly speaking, you're asking 30 times the interviewee. What I did under those circumstances, with agreement of the questionnaire designer, that we only did So, for example, I think there were 10 questions in 4 categories, and all those questions were the same in the different categories. And the questionnaire developer agreed with my suggestion that we only ask the first 10, because it doesn't matter if it's in a different category, the question stays the same. So yeah, if you've got a series of questions that are repetitive, but in different categories of the questionnaire, you only need to carry out interview once.
Mhm. Yes, because many times we'll have like the same sentence structure and only the symptom changes. So we normally just test the first one, and then for the rest we just test what differs and ask to confirm that if they understood it, if they matched the question, that the response choices and so on. But we just focus on what we haven't tested, in order to not to tire or exhaust really the patient. Okay. Thank you. And Eva asks, I usually send the questions beforehand and ask them to answer the questions, but they don't have to give me the answer. I want to know how they answer the questions. How did the question affect you? Is it offensive? Was it difficult to answer it? If so, how? Then you want clear, well-drafted questions to work with.
So sending the questionnaire to the respondent and asking them those questions and then doing the cognitive interview?
It's like we normally send the questionnaire beforehand to the patients, or the respondents, and they answer themselves at home, and we call them. So it's like we don't have their feedback while they are filling in.
No, again, that's retrospective, isn't it? Basically.
Yes, that's what I mentioned. That's what, like, in the linguistic validation cognitive debriefing methodology, it has commonly been done like that. But it's true that it has its setbacks because you can't see the person. And even though you ask them retrospectively, how Eva says, how did the question affect you? Is it offensive? And so on. But it's true that you don't see the face of the person. You don't know exactly what they answered.
No.
And so on. So
it's not strictly a cognitive interview.
Okay. Well, then all of us need to change what we're doing, because most of the companies.
So you mean a phone interview is strictly speaking not a cognitive interview?
No. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah,
that was something I wanted to ask.
But we can do it in video, right? Because nowadays it's true that since we are getting so many, like we are doing more cognitive interviews than ever. The COAs are becoming endpoints in clinical trials more, or outcome measures more than ever, and getting people in real life, it's much more difficult. And since the deadlines are very tight in clinical trials, it's true that we have moved on since COVID-19 really to doing video calls and to have the person seeing the person and so on. But it's true that we don't stay with the person looking at what they are doing and filling in, right? Most of the time, or at least some companies, you send it first and you don't see what they are doing. So I'm understanding now that one very important thing we should do is so we need to observe the patient while they are filling in the questionnaires. So that's a very good point too.
Best if we can.
Yeah, we're going to say something, Tomislav. Sorry.
No, I'm just curious. I didn't understand what your stand on video calls for doing the cognitive interviews. So do they constitute proper cognitive interviews?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Same as face to face.
It was somehow intuitive to me also. I've had only several projects where the client would request to have the instrument tested via phone call. It was a specific request.
Via what? Sorry.
That the cognitive debriefing was conducted using a phone call. I've had several projects like that,
yeah.
but it was in cases where the instrument administration mode was also intended to be done over the phone. I remember there was one of the EQ5D that was adapted for use over the phone during the COVID crisis. So it was intuitive to me that we should always do cognitive interviews in the same manner that they are intended to be administered with the actual patients. So if it's face-to-face, then either face-to-face or via video call, and if it's over the phone, then over the phone.
Yeah, yeah. I've done one over the phone, and it's again it's not particularly effective. Again, because it's difficult to do the probes. It's difficult to see what expressions the person has on their face. Yeah, face to face or video is obviously better, much better.
I have a comment from Eva and from myself as well, and it's true that many people demand only phone call, or they just don't want to do it via video. Most cases
Well,
with children, they are very shy, or
you have
people,
to,
aged people, and
yeah.
so,
Well, you have to do it, but I think in that case it's doing it, but as the person that's doing it and writing the report is then to say, well, okay, these were the limitations, and or your contractor finds alternative people to interview.
Yeah, we tend to get very skilled in hearing, and the size, the different sounds that the person does, and you can realize if they are having problems or not. Yeah. Yeah, but it's good to know that it's like exceptional. No, let's use the phone only in cases that there's no other option, or the person really doesn't want to be on a video call, and indicated in the report. This was
Eva just mentioned there that she's been asked that she meets the interviewees previous to the interview. I don't know. I can't see any problem with that. Maybe it does break the ice a bit. I don't know. It's I can't see any harm in it.
No, it's like in the past we were asked to meet the participants face to face, but not anymore. And I'm saying because it speeds things up really to be able to do it. And we can find, let's say in our single country, we can find a lot of people if we can take the entire country and not just our particular area. So we have a question from Mariana Teixeira. She says, do you think with the growing use of COAs, namely PROs in research and the patient-centered approach, we are seeing growing today, COA development will become more standardized and maybe include cultural adaptation earlier? Okay, you're saying if it will include in the development phase, right? Cultural adaptation or the translatability assessment earlier in the development, yes.
Yes. Yeah, very much so.
You think it will happen?
Earlier and earlier that the patients are involved in the work, whether it's through cognitive interviewing or whatever, much better. I mean, the whole approach now is that we've patient centricity is the key word now, and we need to do that.
She as I understand it, is referring to translatability assessment, to linguists doing cultural adaptation during the development phase of the COA.
Oh yeah. If the measure is going to be used cross-culturally, yes, absolutely. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier on about those two approaches to developing a measure, whether you take an existing measure and culturally adapt it, or to make sure that the translations of it are true, or you develop a questionnaire for each specific language. So it's again, yeah, it's getting the patient involved directly.
I don't know if any of you would like to ask something else.
There was one question. I
Yes.
caught it. Someone was asking.
Yeah, go.
Whether there was a 25% discount on attendees today to the workshop.
Oh, okay, that's a good question.
The answer to
that's
the
a great
answer to
discount.
that is yeah. The answer to that is no.
He's already going to give much more than he's asking for. So, but it's a good question.
Yeah, it's a very good question.
Yes. Anything else? Anyone here? Before we wrap up, Tomislav, would you like to add something?
No, I think we covered most of the planned topics for today, and we overstepped our planned time limit. It was a great discussion, and thank you, Dr. Meadows, for
I
joining
really
us
enjoyed it.
today.
I enjoyed
It was really a
and please,
pleasure.
it's Keith, not Dr. Meadows.
Of course. For the audience.
Thank you so much. And if you have any questions for us.
No, that was fine. It was really enjoyable.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you so much. And to all of you who are watching as well or listening, and to remind you that Keith, not Dr. Meadows, is going to have his workshop next week on February 12th. And we hope you'll join us, because I will be there, and Tomislav will be there, and many others from here. So it will be a great experience.
With regard to the workshop, I want it to be really interactive. I've tried to design it so that to get people thinking, but again, I want the workshop to be informal, and and people asking questions, because I don't want to just be here going through my slides. I want it to be interactive and people to feel relaxed and asking cheeky questions.
Cheeky questions, yes, we will. For sure.
Well, I'll dig out that reference regarding the international workshop that I ran back in 2000, and I'll email that to you now. Is that okay?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording, but stay with us for a minute.
Okay.
Thank you so much for you watching us and for being here in the Linguistic Validation Café. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and especially to our community of the Linguistic Validation Café, since this is a joint venture and its creation is the result of all of us together. The Linguistic Validation Café is an informal monthly gathering within the Art of Diversity Linguistic Validation Training Program.